I have us being, and we are on air, so I have us being in chapter 22 of the evangelism book, and that is page 374 is what I have it as. And we're supposed to talk about church planting. This is what chapter into some details. Basically, he's saying, which is something I've heard for the last probably decade, that sometimes the best way to grow your church is to start new churches. There's been some studies, and he does give some of those, talks about that and give us details. In some studies, the churches start other churches actually grow themselves, because people do see that there's something going on there. The other thing he mentions is that a lot of times a church, a new church, for whatever reason, it's easier for a new church to grow than for an existing church. A church that's been around for multiple decades to actually back off and start brand new. It's I know at Dixie, go into some of their stages, and I know what went on there. Before Reverend Cockrell came, she was there before me. But before Reverend Cockrell came, the man who was there he grew the church. The church was one of the fastest growing in the association when he was there. But he was also one that he liked to have his hands in the pocketbook. And when right towards the end of his tenure, which he got off, but right before the end of his tenure, he and the treasurer were kind of together. And when they would do their business meetings, the treasurer only reported that they paid. He didn't report what the actual bills were. So if they weren't paying a bill, he didn't even report it. Even when Reverend Cockrell was there, Reverend Cockrell got a lot of fixed. In the first few years of him being there, we had to pay cash for school materials because the Dixon had a bad name at the Sunday school board for not paying their bills. They'd gone several years not paying their bills for Sunday school material. But that pastor, whenever the deacons finally decided to ask him to leave, well, like many congregations, there was a lot of people in the church that didn't know all of what was going on behind the scenes, and they thought he was the best thing in the world. And there were those who knew what was going on, and I think the straw that broke the camel's back, he was building him a house out in Gaston, and they had a daycare at the church at that time. And for a field trip, he would bring those kids out to his house to have them pick up the rocks and stuff in the yard. And did not make sure they had sunscreen, and when they got back and were all sunburnt, they had a lot of families upset. And so, needless to say, it was not a good situation, and he told the leaders at that time, he said, I will tear this church apart before I leave. And that is what he did. When they kicked him out finally, the church had dwindled from somewhere around 300 down to 20. And even when I became pastor there, after 12, I think Reverend Cockrell was there for 12 years, and he had done a lot of fence mending and made a lot of things right. When I would go across the street to Lloydwood, there were still people that said, oh, you're from Dixie? I don't want to talk to you. We had a bad reputation. It's hard to fix that. It's hard to make people think that, well, we're changed now, we're different. We have a different philosophy, a different way of doing things. And whereas a new church, there is no background, there's no history, there is no baggage, so to speak. So a lot of times a church start can grow church that's been there for many years, it's just part of nature. Any organization is going to make some people mad. They just are. There are people, I'm sure, that's left this church because they got angry about something. As a matter of fact, I can, we all know, I'm not going to mention names, but we know that left when we got here were upset that they didn't get called here. It's part of life. And we've got to learn as a church, if we're going to grow, we've got to figure out, well, how do we grow? Now, what he says in this chapter makes sense to me. When you start a new church, that's like having a baby. How do you grow a family? You have children. A new church is having a child, and it does take effort. The church that sponsors that new start has to help that church, help it to grow and provide support for the church. Just like you provide support for your children and teach them to walk and teach them to eat, teach them to, ABCs and things like that. Well, the sponsoring church has to do similarly. Whenever we think about, and he talks about this in here, a lot of churches that are currently around, that have been around for years, and you'll hear them make those objections, but we already have lots of churches. Isn't there plenty of room for everybody? He gives something here that I thought was kind of interesting, and I don't see the statistic right here in front of me, but it used to be, and I got this number right, but it used to be that there was one church for every 1,000 people back in the 60s and 70s. As far as Southern Baptists go, and now it's like for every 1,200. So, we don't have the same number of churches per our population that we used to, because we're not starting the churches that we used to. Now, I do know that it used to be, and it was almost a joke, but the joke was almost, how do churches grow? They get angry at each other and split. We all probably have stories, churches we know that came from a split from some other church. But there are better ways to plant churches as well. A church split's not a good way to start a church. But there is room for other churches. There are people, and I've said this before, and I say it still now, there are people we can reach that Ebenezer can't reach. There are people that Ebenezer can reach that we will never reach. Because I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm not saying that we don't need to be energetic and have excitement, but I've never been one to have a church service that to me seemed like there was no order. I do not like chaos. And I think the Bible's pretty clear about our services need to be in order and need to have a certain shape to them. That there doesn't need to be all this chaos. And when I've gone to Pentecostal holiness churches, a lot of times I don't know what's going on because it seems like it's all chaos. When I was in college in the revival team, we did a homecoming for one of the girls, and she belonged to, and they called themselves a non-denominational, but they were Pentecostal. That is what they were. And before they didn't have a service that morning, which I thought was odd, until I realized afterwards why they didn't have the morning service. They had a praise service for those of us who were going to be ministering that afternoon and after the lunch hour. Well, when we started the lunch hour at noon, we didn't get away from it until 7 o'clock that night. So they didn't have a morning service for everybody because they had all-day service for everybody. But in that praise service to supposedly get us ready, there was people falling on the floor and shaking and just gibbering and jabbering, and I didn't. to me, that didn't get me ready. That didn't put me in the spirit. And I'm not saying there aren't some people that does. And if that puts you in feeling like you're gaining something, then by all means, I would recommend you go to Ebenezer or go to a Pentecostal church, because you won't find that here. But you also won't find here a big liturgical service like a Lutheran church, or even a Methodist church has a long liturgy that they go through. That's not us either. Now, it has surprised me. Is there even a Lutheran church in South Congaree? Is there one?
Well, I don't know if it's in South Congaree, but you go up Pine Street.
Yeah, now, Emmanuel Lutheran? Yeah, that's up there in Three Fountains. I guess that is the closest one to South Congaree. Is there a Methodist church in South Congaree?
Oh, yeah.
Is it? Are they Methodist?
Yeah.
I thought they were independent.
Well, they used to be Methodist now. They might be going independent.
I know their website indicates they're independent.
Well, I know when I first come to Colonian.
They were Methodist?
Because one of the women that worked with me went up there.
Okay.
And I went there basically Methodist. And I was a Methodist at that time too.
Which Methodist and Baptist are probably the closest to each other.
Methodist and Lutheran.
I mean, as far as when you look at the differences between us, we're closer to Methodist than we are to Lutheran. We're closer probably to Methodist than we are to Presbyterian. I've known Baptists that switched to Methodist and don't have any problem with it, and I've known Methodists that switched to Baptist and don't have any problem with it. I know when I was at Dixiana, I actually had a Methodist preacher preach one of our revivals, and he preached the same thing that I would have preached. But I know that when you get Lutheran, you get a little different mindset sometimes, and when you get Presbyterian, you get a very different mindset a lot of times. And
Reading lots of that prayer.
yeah. But there is room for all these churches in our neighborhood because there's people that aren't in church. And to say that, well, we don't want to start a new church 4 streets down because it might interfere with us, well, I would guarantee you there are people that would go to a different church than us 4 streets down just because of the focus of that ministry more so than our focus. I think we will probably reach someone who's more into a traditional Southern Baptist church. I just think that that's who we target. And there are people here in this neighborhood, in this community, that's what they're looking for. We just haven't been real good at finding them, I don't think. I think there are a lot of churches, and I'm going through their objections here that he talks about why plant churches, some of the objections. That every church in this community used to be more full than it is now. Well, I do agree with him here. If you're just trying to get people to jump from one church to your church, you just get in trouble. Because the main reason they're leaving that other church is they're probably not happy, they're not content, and I really don't want discontents coming here. I'd rather find people that need Christ, that are looking for someone to guide them and direct them, than someone who's malcontent trying to come and just stir up trouble. Help the churches that are struggling. I like his statement. What better way to help a struggling church than to get it involved in planning another church? That would help a struggling church. I have mentioned before, whenever we first started I just lost it. The program we just went through, the intentional church growth, ICMP. Whenever we started that, I mentioned that I honestly think that it would be better for us to look at church planting over trying to grow to 100, 300, 400 members, because I honestly think we stand a better chance of reaching people that are looking for a small group that they can fit in, that they can feel a part of. Whereas if they want a large church, there's plenty of large churches. There's lots of large churches. But small churches have a place where people need that closeness want to go. Now, how we start churches, how we do a church plant, he talks about it in here, and he says he's going to give us all these plans. I will be honest, I didn't read a whole lot in here that gave me the plan to start churches other than we needed to have one. I do think that our convention and our association can help us with that. I do know when I was at Dixiana, and I'm not going to tell you that this was the best approach, because I don't think that it was as successful as I wanted it to be. But we did see quite a few baptisms. We started a church there in the trailer park, down there near Sandy Run, and I just lost the name of the trailer park, but we had mentioned Rolling Meadows. We actually called one of your ex-preachers to come and be our minister down there, Reverend Sharp, and he went and he taught, he got children. He was not very successful at getting adults. We were never successful at reaching into the adults in that community. I just think that that was a hard community to reach adults in, because a lot of the adults in that community were suffering. They were either single parents, or they had moved there because they'd lost jobs, or they were struggling. They were really struggling, and a church plant that doesn't have a whole lot of money in their pockets, there just isn't a whole lot they can do to help other than, we'll take your kids and teach them the Bible. The first year, Reverend Sharp did baptize, I think it was close to 20 children. And those children remained faithful. They went to church religiously, and it was their church. We'd have them out to Vacation Bible School, because we'd open our Bible school to them, and Reverend Sharp he'd drive the bus up there, and he was, he would take part in the Bible school. He would teach, and he would help with the Bible school stuff. His wife would, and it was a joint effort. And I felt like that it helped Dixiana probably way more than it helped him. But we provided financial support. The association provided financial support for 2 years. That's where I think that we don't have it quite right. That's saying, well, we'll provide support for 2 years and then you've got to be on your own. There are some church plants that take more than 2 years to get on their feet. There just are. It's just the nature of the community they've moved into. So I'm not sure that that's the best approach. And he talks about that approach and how that there are sometimes that works really well. You go in the inner city where you have a large apartment building and you put someone, a minister, in an apartment. You pay for his apartment and you get him and his wife has to be along with him, and they start church in that apartment. They are more likely able to reach those in that apartment building. And if they do it right, if they're living there, and they decide to have Bible studies on Tuesday nights or Thursday nights or Monday nights or even Wednesday nights in their apartment building, they're going to reach adults that way. And those situations, there have been a lot of success stories written about those situations where within 2 years, those apartment churches just are booming. They're busting at the seams. You go into trailer parks in rural areas like we're in, or suburban areas, not downtown areas, and it's a lot harder. A lot harder. It doesn't always happen that you can say, all right, we're giving you 2 years to get on your feet. That just doesn't always work. There has been a big push in this last, probably the last 10 to 15 years. And as a matter of fact, we just started one. They just started one in my neighborhood, doing church homes, or home churches, or whatever you want to call it. think it's First Baptist West Columbia has actually started the one there in my neighborhood. There was a big write-up about it in the in Lexington association stuff. And, they're trying to reach people. As a matter of fact, they're having a block party Monday, being that it's Memorial Day. I think that's a good thing. I know when I was at, when we lived over there on Beechwood Drive in Cedarwood subdivision, there's a house right there in the front of the neighborhood that started a house church. That does seem to be a way that church plants have been started. And I understand how that can be successful, because there are people that are more comfortable coming to someone's house than pulling into this driveway and feeling like, well, especially someone who grew up feeling like, well, I have to dress up. I've got to wear a jacket and tie and be all uncomfortable, even though they don't wear that during the work day. I was just watching this morning, and I will be honest, I feel more comfortable. Now, I don't mind not wearing a tie, but I feel more comfortable on Sunday morning wearing a tie than I feel not wearing a tie. I don't feel comfortable wearing a polo shirt and no jacket and blue jeans, but I know churches that's the way they do. I do know in our business world today, it used to be the only day you could go casual to work was maybe on a Friday. I know when I started at DOT, which was in '86, our director of IT, he said, we make more money than most people who work here. You are going to wear a tie to work. And we did. And as a matter of fact, it was one day I went into work. Now, when I worked in Maryland up at the Navy, I could go and I had to wear slacks. I couldn't wear blue jeans, but I could wear polo shirts. As long as it had a collar, I could wear a polo shirt. And I got used to that. Well, there was one day I went into work and I had forgotten my tie. And I got sent back home to get a tie. And was strongly suggested that I bring a tie and leave in my drawer, in my desk drawer. It was just, that was the expectation. And I remember it was so almost odd. It was one summer, the air conditioning went out in that building on Park Street. And our director of IT, he sent out a memo and basically said, until we get this fixed, you can come without a tie to work. He never required a tie again after that. It was almost funny. Once the door was opened, it was wide open. I know most businesses today, they were talking about that this morning, most businesses today either have a business casual approach, or even some of them go so far as to let you come in blue jeans and whatever you want to come to work in. So I understand that for us to reach the generation that's 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, for us to expect that they're going to want to wear a tie to church, most of them might not even own a tie. As a matter of fact, I would venture to say that some of them probably, even when they went to prom, they had to rent their coats and everything and their tie because they didn't even own a tie. Yeah, I remember as a child, goodness, I can remember Mom and Dad making me wear the bow tie until I got old enough to wear a long tie. And I mean, it was just the expectation. When you went to church, you had a tie on. But I know that for us to look at other churches and to look at church models and church growth models, sometimes you have to relax those things because that really has the gospel doesn't say anything about whether we should wear a tie or not. As a matter of fact, when the Bible was written, there were no ties. That wasn't even part of their custom. As a matter of fact, it talks more in the Bible about whether or not you should wash someone's feet because they've been in sandals all day. I don't know many of us that wear sandals all day, except for my daughter who wears flip-flops, even when we tell her not to. But that's a whole other story. Most of us, we've grown up in this society wearing shoes. And if you're a man, you probably wore socks and shoes. It's just the way our society is. we think sometimes because of the way church was, and I'm not talking about what we preach, I'm talking about how we do things. We think, well, that is how you should do things. That's biblical. Well, what he says in this chapter and what he did to is one of the reasons a church plant sometimes is easier to grow a church is because they don't have all those preconceived things going on in them. They're starting fresh. I know when I was at Connery Baptist as the Brotherhood director, we had a guy come in, the association let me know about him. They had just started a church, I want to say it was out in Gilbert, and they were growing, just hand over fist growing. Well, who they were reaching were these people that had come out of the motorcycle gangs. Some rough characters, but people that needed reaching nonetheless. Now, he did talk about when you go into their service, you're going to find people dressed in leather or blue jeans, or that's what they wore. And nobody said anything about it because that was who they were reaching. You wouldn't find that in most churches that are already organized and have their way of doing things, because they won't feel comfortable there. So I understand what he's getting at in this chapter, that church plants sometimes they can be more focused on a need than a church that's already organized. And maybe we focus more on those that either fallen away from church or those that grew up. I think they grow up in church in the 20s or early 20s. They disenfranchised. They begin to see what's underneath the cover. It's odd when you're a child and you don't think about what the actual workings are. You think, well, I can hardly wait to get on my own, and goodness, I'm gonna have me a car, and I'm gonna have a house, and I'm gonna eat what I want to eat. And then you get out on your own, and you begin to see, well, goodness, I can't afford to eat what I want to eat. I can't afford that fancy car I wanted. Goodness, I can't even afford the fancy building I wanted to live in. And all of a sudden, you begin to realize that what you didn't know as a child, you find out. Well, there's a lot of times, especially when you're in a church and you're growing up in that church and you don't realize all the work that's involved in taking youth to a camp. You don't realize all the work that's involved in putting on Vacation Bible School. You don't realize all the work that's involved in teaching a class. And now all of a sudden you become 18, 19, and the church starts asking you to take those roles, and you don't want to do that, so you drop out. And when they usually come back to church? When they get married and have kids. And they begin to realize, my kids need to know about God. Well, there's a good point to minister to them, because they grew up in church, but they've left church. Those are who I think we can reach better than trying to go out and reach some group that doesn't fit the mold of an established church. I do think that we need to look at and begin thinking about, well, how do we help plant a church? He gives several models here, and he talks about who the biblical model is, and how it works. Some of the modern models. It talks about the apostolic harvest church planter. I've never heard it called that, but anyway, it's you basically start the church and you move on, like Paul did. He would start the church, he'd leave someone there, and he would move on to another place to start another church. That's where you have someone who their whole focus for their whole ministry is starting churches, and there are people that do that. That is where they feel called. They feel they able to get something stirred up, started, and get everything organized and get people in there and start making things happen, and then that's really the end of their ability. They're not settled enough to take it the next step, but they are good at doing that start and then bringing in someone who is the one to begin establishing it as a regular thing. Paul did that. There is what they call the founding pastor, which is what probably most of us are familiar with. You might start it with someone who is going to be the church planner, but then he becomes the long-term pastor, and he stays there and gets it going. And the examples they give is Rick Warren. Many of us have heard of him, and Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon, when he started the church there in England, it was just a little small congregation, First Baptist type church in that area, and then it grew to where they had to create the temple that they met in. They actually called it a temple back then. Then he goes into the team planning, where you actually bring in a team, and sometimes he mentions Paul has used that before. Whenever you have like Paul and Silas, Paul and Timothy, and those, you bring a team in, and once you've got the church planted, you might leave one, or you might bring a whole other person in to actually become the pastor. But there's many different models, and I'm not even sure that those are the only models. I do think that there are other models today. He talks about one of them in particular, and one that we've talked about, and I'm not real strong about it. I really am not sure that it's the right approach, but I'm not going to tell you it's the wrong approach, and that's the churches that have multiple campuses. To me, I'm not comfortable with that. It's not for me. I understand that we live in a day and age when people like technology, and we're doing technology right now. I don't mind putting our messages, putting our services out on the internet. I think that is a way to use technology. I am leery, though, of opening up another place far from us, setting up closed caption TV to that place, and then setting up, for lack of a better word, under pastors to pastor that church, but that when you come to church, your whole goal is to watch me on a screen. That's not for me. But I know people that like that. I know people that enjoy that. As a matter of fact, I would venture to say that there's a lot of the teenagers and early 20-year-olds and things like that that feel comfortable with that because they've gone to movies their whole life. They've watched TV their whole life. They're not. It doesn't bother them. They're used to the floating head, so to speak. When they go to a concert, most of the kids today, when they go to a concert, they don't watch the stage, they watch the screen because they can get a better, clearer picture of the screen that's right there at them than they can that 500 feet away of what's on the stage that looks like an ant. And, even when we've gone to the Gaithers, the last time we went, we got real close seats, and I'll be honest, it felt like it blew me out of the arena because it was so loud when you're down right there at them. And I enjoy the music, but still, it can be too loud. So I understand that there's a whole generation that's grown up with technology, and that doesn't bother them. But I also know that whenever who you see on the screen is not the person that ministers to you, to me it puts a distance between me and the person I'm ministering to that I don't get to know them. And whenever you have death, whenever you have an event in your family, how is that minister that's 200 miles away going to even know about it? He doesn't. I mean, honestly, that's one of the problems I have with the mega churches where they all meet in a huge church with 4,000 or 5,000 members, because I just don't. You can't get there and be a minister who ministers to the congregation. When you're at that size, the one who's preaching basically has to have other ministers that ministers to individuals. I'll be honest, I feel like God has called me to draw close to those I minister to. For them to know me and me to know them, for us to learn each other's wrinkles and each other's, good and bad, and to love each other, because that's what we're called to do. That's where I feel like I'm called to be the minister of. So it's hard for me to say, well, we need to follow one of these approaches that pushes the pastor away from everybody, and all of a sudden all he's focused on is his group of ministers, and he becomes distant and doesn't know half the people, doesn't even know a third of the people in the congregation. I have problems with that. And don't get me wrong, I've read, I understand, I know all the arguments, I know that, well, that's why you have small groups, that's why you have this, that's why you have that. I understand that, but if I'm going to be the minister, I want to minister. I want the congregation to feel like when someone's in the hospital, they can call me and let me know. I know when friends of mine who go to the big church, when they've lost family members, they actually called me to come do funerals for them because they know me. Or, if I were the local minister at that mega church's campus, I would almost wonder, well, why didn't they call me to do that? Or does that even come to their mind? Do they even think about the fact that they should have known about that member enough to know what was going on? That, to me, is where I question that as a church model. I have problems with that. But I do know that there are a lot of people that come to Christ in those churches. I know the one up in Greenville. I've been to visit them before, not as actually, we were working on a website that impacted one of their ministries that they had, and they had huge ministry. I mean, it was a wonderful thing. That part of it excited me because they actually had a store where people that were street people could come in, and I mean, it wasn't like, the ones here where they actually had to pay a little bit. This was where they could come and get their bare needs. If they needed a blanket, they had a whole stockroom full of blankets, and they would help them with a blanket to keep them warm. If they needed food, they would help them with food. If they needed something to eat right then and there, they would help them get something, and they had actually a kitchen. They would cook for them. That, to me, was amazing, because that's something that we couldn't do here, really. We don't have the number of people to do something like that here.
That's the way Brooklyn Baptist on 378 up there does.
Yeah.
They have so many staff people, paid staff people, that they provide lunch for them every day of the week, and people off the street can come in. I've been invited to go and eat lunch up there.
And so, I do grasp that a larger church is going to be able to have things that we're not able to have. But I also know that the General Joe that's sitting in the pew on Sunday morning in that church, the preacher probably doesn't know him from Adam's house. I know each and every person that comes in here, and believe me, I pray for you weekly. Every week you're lifted up because I know you by name. And to me, that's more important as a minister than to have some huge congregation that I become lost and I'm just the person who stands on Sunday morning. I do know that we need to be looking at, well, how do we share the gospel? How do we get the gospel out there? I think planting churches is a good approach. I think there is some good there. I still, and I think I've shared somewhat with Don about some of this on occasion, and I know I've prayed about it quite lengthily. There are times, and I'm not really that much of a rebel. I really have always wanted to try to fit into place and do what I'm supposed to do and keep my nose clean and everything else. But there are times when I think that following God might mean doing something that the association or the convention or that tradition tells us is not the way to do it. There are times I think God may want us to do something that is so out of the ordinary, so different from what everybody else is doing, that's what draws people to Him. I don't know yet what that is. I'll be honest. I am praying for God to give me that wisdom. I do think that we need to build a building. I really do. I think that that's our first start. But I'm thinking, goodness, I go back and forth on this. I question, do we need to get into a traditional plan of church building stuff? I know the convention has probably a half a dozen different plans on how to raise funds and how to build a church building and things of that nature. But is that really the right approach? And I'm not sure that it is. I'm not sure that us looking like every other Southern Baptist church is what this area needs us to look like. This area might need us to look like more of a traditional church. Because I know recently a lot of the Southern Baptist push is for you to look odd or different or have some unique thing about your building. A lot of them have these rounded front ends, or like Springdale, they went down that path and there's not even a door on the front of their church. I'm not sure that that's the approach we need to take, or do we need to look at following what the artist rendering is and make more of a traditional building like we're used to seeing, which goes against everything church growth experts tell you today. They say, no, you don't want it to look like what people grew up with 20 years ago. You want it to be different. You don't want it to look like a church because that will push people away. Well, I'm sorry. Sometimes I think maybe we do need to look like a church. Maybe we do need to look more like what people are searching for so that they know it when they see it.
If you look at Willow Ridge in Northside, you almost would not know that there.
No, you wouldn't. Yeah,
It's some big institute.
Yeah, it does. Or a big school or something. They look almost like a college campus.
They look at Trinity over there.
Yeah. And I'm not sure in this area that would get us anything. Because I think in this area, in South Congaree, we have a completely, it's almost like it's completely different between here and even when you go down to Gilbert or when you go over to Casey. South Congaree has its own way of doing things. They just do. Pine Ridge has its own way of doing things. And so I'm thinking, in order for us to reach the people in this area, maybe we do need to look more like what this area is looking for. Even if that goes against the wisdom of all those smart people around us. But I do think we need to become involved in doing something to help our community know. And I think we are, honestly. I'm excited about the rodeo. I really think that even though who we're reaching is going to leave this place and go somewhere else, I really feel like we can reach some of those cowboys. They might become our missionaries. Take the Christ that we've shared with them. I am excited about kids camp. And, I understand that, almost every year we have 400 to 600 kids that make some decision for Christ. And I understand that it's hard to see, has that made any real difference? You really don't know until 20 years from now whether that made a real difference. But you know what? I have faith in the Holy Spirit that there's at least some of those 400 to 600 kids every year it made a big difference in. And there are some of those kids that's going to be the next preachers, the next Sunday school teachers. And we need to be in prayer for that ministry, because that's how we reach. That's how we share for the future. I would want to say that in the next, and I'm going to say 2 years, I hope in the next 2 years that we have begun the task of planting a church somewhere. That's my hope. I like to sometimes put those kind of goals out there just so that y'all might hold me to it. So, let's be praying for that, thinking about that. I am going to call it a night. We will actually start on chapter 23. Can you believe there's really only about 4 more chapters left in this book? And then we're going to write up a diploma for Mr. Ed. Because he says he feels like he's been to college with this book. I'm going to ask Brother Ed if he would close us in prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, we thank you tonight, Lord, for who you are and how you bless us, Lord.
Yes.
For your grace and your love. And Lord, we pray that the Holy Spirit will lead us to spread this love and grace to our neighbors, Lord, and those around us, Lord, family, Lord, that they might come to know Jesus as their Savior. And we pray now, Lord, as we go out, and we might take what we've heard with us and use it for your glory. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.